Welcome everyone to panel 3, how community-based organizations promote high-quality social emotional learning. My name is Stephanie Carmona and currently the work-based learning manager for the post-secondary readiness team at Urban Assembly. Before I introduce our fantastic, brilliant panelists, quick reminder, if anyone has any questions, please click on the Q&A tab, type in your question and click submit. Note, you will also have the option to submit a private question to the speaker by ticking the send private option. When doing so, this question will only be visible to the speaker and will not be visible to other attendees. So without further ado, here are your panelists. We're going to start off with RB Alverna. Hello. RB Alverna is the founder and chief executive officer of the Academy 365, Inc. Under the leadership of RB Alverna, the Academy 365 impacts the lives of young Black men through mentoring, teaching life skills, and cultivating safe space programming and workshops. Most recently, he brought his talents to the Not Just a Black Boy campaign, a platform that is dedicated to honoring the Black lives that were cut short from COVID-19. I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat that. It's not just a Black body. Sorry about that. While equipping the community with knowledge on the injustices and racism embedded in the healthcare system. RB holds a master's in public administration with a concentration in nonprofit leadership and has recently completed his final year of doctoral coursework in education leadership at Caldwell University. RB Alverna, thank you so much for being here. Next we have Karen J. Pitman. She is the president and CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment. Prior to co-founding the Forum of Youth Investment in 1998, she launched adolescent pregnancy prevention initiatives at the Children's Defense Fund, started the Center for Youth Development and Policy Research, and served as the senior vice president at the International Youth Foundation. Karen was also involved in founding America's Promise and directed the President's Crime Prevention Council during the Clinton administration. She currently sits on the Turnaround for Children board. Karen, thank you so much for joining us. Now we have Lucy Hertz. She is the co-founder and chief operating officer of Student Success Network. Since 2013, Lucy has led the design, development, and implementation of the Student Success Network model that aims at transforming program, practice, and policy in New York City. She is motivated by the power of partnership and fostering intentional collaboration, not competition. She holds a master's of public administration from New York University and a Bachelor of Arts from Columbia University. Thank you, Lucy, for joining us. And finally, we have Dr. Saskia Trail, president and CEO of Expanded Schools. Saskia's worked to build state systems for early care and education. She has authored and co-authored articles for peer-reviewed journals, policy briefs, reports on a range of issues, and an essay on voter registration and a book about civic service, which included being recorded on a CD with Al Gore. Saskia earned her BA at Columbia University and a PhD in research psychology from Stanford University. Panelists, thank you so much for joining us. We are super excited to have you guys here. For more information on our panelists, please read their bios in the SEL Synopsis Symposium agenda seen in the S. Sullivan portal. Now, for our panel discussion, the first component of the discussion will be for the entire panel. Then we will move to specific individual questions. For the sake of time, please, we'll ask our panelists to answer 2 or 3 panelists to answer each question before we move on to the next. So, are we ready? Awesome. So our first question, how do you work with schools to ensure there is an alignment between your work and what students experience in school? Once again, how do you work with schools to ensure there is an alignment between your work and what students experience in your school? Any panelist can answer.
My mother always raised me to let ladies go first.
Well, I can jump in. We're all deferring to each other because it's such an amazing group. So Expanded Schools works in about 900 school and after-school programs in New York City, including many urban assembly schools. And so these are school-based after-school programs. They're funded separately from schools, but they're working in the school building, or in this last year and a half on the same Zooms with young people and their families. And I think it really starts with pulling away some of the policies that create this separation, this sort of 2:30 to 3 o'clock divide for young people, and really trying to get principals and the full-time sort of after-school site director in a room together to talk about what they care about for young people. And that helps kind of create a sense of alignment and shared goals. And there are these sort of false dichotomies in the school and after-school world that, school cares about academics and after school cares about youth development. And we know that's not true. We know that everybody cares about whole children. So we just have to tap back into that, to that shared belief. And then we have to start defining what social emotional learning means for that particular school. What are the goals? What does it mean to have a socially and emotionally sort of healthy school building? And then to just keep reminding folks that that's what they said when they were first planning.
Thank you so much, Saskia. Anyone else?
So for us,
go ahead. Go ahead, RB.
No, I saw you talk, but okay, I'll go. So for us at the Academy, one of the things that we wanted to make sure we did from day one was connect with our boys' schools and make sure that they understood that we were a part of their lives and how we were a part of their lives. So we made sure that we got in contact with every single guidance counselor, every teacher, and we sent them information as to what it is that we were trying to accomplish as an organization and how they could help us. I tell people all the time that we have 21 different issues because we started off small and this year, because of huge blessings, we will be growing. But we wanted to make sure that our schools understood that the issues that our boys may face aren't things that some may understand, but they should know how to address them or what they should look out for. So we felt that the conversations needed to happen from day one. So that's how we've been able to keep them. And then as things continue to arise, we just make sure that we keep in close contact with them, especially during COVID, because that was definitely a time where we needed to make sure that our students and then their teachers and their counselors knew that we were involved, and we wanted to make sure that we did everything on our power to help them transition very well throughout that time.
Good. And I would just add briefly into that mix, the forum still has the pleasure of working with the Wallace Foundation on their Partnerships for Social Emotional Learning initiative, which is working in 6 communities across the country, really trying to build these after-school partnerships at the district level. I really encourage everybody to go to their website and look at the lessons learned. But in a debrief that we just did, looking at this question of sort of how do you get that alignment, which has always been the forum's sort of forte, how do you get alignment across these systems? 2 things came out really clearly. One is the partners really have to understand each other. And Saskia, you said that very well. The shorthand of school, out of school doesn't really help. We do academics, you do youth development. We're the school, you're not, you're the community. They really do need to dig in and understand each other. And one of the things that came out after a couple of years of you can't just zoom in and focus in on how are we going to align our SEL practices and can we all have the same welcoming activities. It really does have to be this broader relationship building. It really has to be intentional connections around leadership and coordinated professional development. All of those things have to happen, but it really does start with relationship building. And I think one of the big lessons learned was it starts with schools really taking the time to know what out-of-school providers and after-school providers can do, and sort of adjusting and recognizing some of the unintentional harm that happens when they just get invited in at the last minute to connect. So there's an entire podcast series that Wallace just did that I would encourage anybody who's interested to listen to. It's a 5-part podcast series, and it really does get into a lot of the insights on this question.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just for that, can you just tell us remind us what is the name of the podcast?
go to the Wallace Foundation's website, and it is the Partnership for Social Emotional Learning Initiative, and it's a 5-part podcast series.
Thank you so
and I'll
much,
try to
Karen.
find the link and drop it in.
Thank you so much. If anyone wants to add, please add so now. If not, I'm going to move forward to the second question. So the second question is, what is the role of community-based organizations in explicit SEL instruction versus just activating these skills? So once again, the question is, what is the role of community-based organizations in explicit SEL instruction versus just activating these skills?
Yeah, so I think for us, we would say that, explicit SEL instruction alone just really isn't enough. At SSN, we interviewed, 50 some odd community-based practitioners about how they support youth SEL development. And the kind of underlying message that we got from all of these folks is that, explicit SEL instruction just won't work without the supportive environment. And so, for example, if I think about a growth mindset, without that supportive environment that really helps students, feel safe enough to practice that growth mindset by, for example, challenging themselves to try new things, that explicit instruction about growth mindset just isn't going to make a difference. If there isn't that culture of care where young people feel that adults really care about their struggle and their joy, that affirms their experiences and identity, again, the explicit SEL instruction just isn't going to have the effect we want it to. And in our experience, CBOs are really well positioned to create these kinds of environments that are supportive of this kind of SEL. And so they really need to be engaged as partners. And I also just want to emphasize that we think about, in order for this to happen, we have to first make sure that staff really feel supported and engaged and connected themselves. So we have to think about how we're supporting staff to then create the kinds of environments that are supportive to students.
One of the things that I know I'm a strong advocate for is making sure we're teaching our children, especially our minorities children, how to manage their emotions, especially while they're navigating through this world. I think a lot of times things are said to them about how they should do certain things or how they should manage certain things, but they're not shown how to do it. They don't see it being actually done in front of them. So we wanted to be prime examples for our boys and how we navigated through our lives and how we handle certain situations and what we could have done correctly or we could have done differently. Especially when dealing with boys, a lot of times what tends to take place is that they don't know how to show the emotions so when it's time for them to manage it, they don't know how to manage it as well. So we took a strong approach as it pertained to that, bringing in the right individuals to be able to help us do that, right professionals to be able to help us do that, and activating it was for us was easy because it became like second nature for us because we knew the only way we were going to be able to be successful with them is if we were very transparent in how we handled social emotional learning for them.
That really resonates, Harvey, I think the nature of explicit SEL instruction has really changed over the last 2 years, and I think we were already evolving as a field, and the pandemic and George Floyd's murder and our sort of racial justice reckoning, I think, got us to really understand that explicit instruction, I think, tends to provoke an idea that a teacher has all the answers and they're teaching you what's on the page, and explicit instruction is intentional focus on social and emotional skill building that's totally youth-centered, right? It's not teacher-centered. The teacher's modeling and maybe talking about personal experience and helping to bring that, but it's intentional focus on social emotional experiences, thoughts, and processes. And if that's really youth-centered, it's sort of naturally totally connected to social justice themes and youth justice themes. But our curriculum is still like, here is how we, taking Lucy's example, growth mindset is this, you need to do this. And it's got to be much more dynamic and intentional. And I think we're getting a lot better, but we still have some ways to go.
Definitely totally correct about that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. We're going to go on to our third question, which is just based on the data, research, and what you guys have been seeing. What are communities mostly asking when it comes to coming around SEL? So once again, just based on the data research that you guys have had, personal experience, what are communities mostly asking when it comes to SEL?
A lot of people from our community, one of the first things that they said when we were planning the academy and putting it together, they said they wanted people who can relate to their kids. A lot of times the kids, their boys, their sons, their nephews, their brothers were at schools where people couldn't relate to them, and that became an issue. So as a Black man in America for the past 36 years, I knew what it took. And I knew that what it was going to take for us to be able to be successful with the boys and in the community as well. The communities in which we're here in New Jersey and in Essex County, and they've been so receptive to what it is that we're trying to do, because we're covering everything from mental health all the way down to the legal system and how it directly affects them. So our community was definitely receptive, and the one thing they just kept saying, they want our boys and they want their children to be around people that can relate to them. So then the teaching just becomes easy because once you're able to relate and communicate, those two things will take place naturally. And then the educational part, the educational piece, the practitioner that we take, it becomes like second nature.
Yeah, I would go back to what Saskia and RB were describing earlier around, SEL that's really dynamic and student-centered and focused on social justice. We think about SEL that's transformative and liberatory, and that isn't just about teaching students kind of a set of behaviors. Our network's been really inspired by Castle's framework around transformative SEL, which kind of describes SEL as a lifelong process for, I might be butchering this, but I think it's around creating personal community and societal well-being. And so the end goal isn't, a group of young people kind of following the rules, but it's really actions like authentic partnership between young people and adults, examining injustices and biases together, instruction that kind of honors and centers on students' lived experiences. And so when I think about what communities are asking for, I think about this kind of type of SEL.
Yeah. And I will not try to go get a link, since the last time I tried to go grab a link, I ended up disconnecting myself. So I'm not good at that. But the Education Trust about 6 months ago put out a piece on that was looking at focus groups and interviews with Black and Brown families about what they were looking for in SEL, and RB's points are spot on, as well as Lucy's. It is first that you've got people that respect their kids and start with the assumption that they have skills, not that they really have to be undoing skills, recognizing that skills come out in different are manifested in different kinds of behavior depending on the environment. And that often when young people are in an environment that they feel is hostile, you're not going to see a skill presentation in the way that you might think it should be. But that doesn't mean that young people don't have those skills, that they can show up in other spaces. It really means you have to adjust your environment. And so one of the big messages that came out, especially when this was a study looking at what parents wanted from schools, was like, we want you to respect, our kids, our families, and our cultures first. Then we'll let you talk about helping them build skills. And so I think when you're looking at what families are looking for in community programs, and a study just came out this week or just last week from Learning Heroes, interviewing families, they really are being very intentional about selecting community organizations and programs that they think are going to build the right kind of relationships, help their young people really sort of develop experiences, develop friendships, find interest-driven ways that they want to grow and develop, and find and meet people like them and not like them. So it's all packaged together, and that word transformative that Lucy just used is a word that's increasingly being used. So we're not just building skills for the sake of building skills so we can, perform in school or we can behave. We're building skills to transform ourselves and our communities.
I know that the folks in this who joined the conference today are probably not in this camp. There are also schools that call us as an after school intermediary who want behavior to change, right? We're calling the after school folks because we want to change behavior. So I think we're all on a journey, and people are different places. And so when someone calls and says, you know, I want my kids to behave, my suspensions are high, they're just not doing what I want, it's an opportunity to have this kind of a conversation. So there are still folks reaching out for kind of the maybe the old tropes of social emotional behavior change and, you know, behaving in the classroom. And you kind of have to meet them where they are and then offer, you know, there are some new ways to think about this that you might want to consider. But that could be a journey, and it can take years in a school with principal turnover and resistant or reluctant teachers. And so, I sort of honor that at the same time as I'm frustrated by it. It's like we you know, we're all on this journey together, and that means there's going to be some folks catching up.
I love that, Saskia, the shifting of the mindset too. It's so important. And I really want to emphasize also what Karen has said about whatever organization wants to work with the school or whoever one wants to work with the community, like values and the mission should align, because that's where we'll see success and how partnerships and relationships can flourish. Thank you, all of you, for answering that very intense question. And I think it was my favorite question for the entire panel, but we have one more question until I dive into the individual questions. So our final one is, what is the best way to ensure that SEL programming honors the cultural foundations of a community? So once again, what is the best way to ensure that SEL programming honors the cultural foundation of a community?
Okay, I'll go. Actually, repeat the question again.
Yes, and it kind of also goes with what Karen had mentioned, but what is the best way to ensure that SEL programming honors the cultural foundations of a community?
Oh, so having a greater understanding of what the community needs. I think a lot of times organizations come into community or pop up in communities and don't have an understanding of what those communities actually need. So when I did my market research for the academy, I had known that there was nothing really in Essex County, New Jersey that was really set for Black boys. So when I was doing the market research, I was really looking to make sure that we weren't going to be a mimic of something else. So having an understanding of what communities need, what communities are actually looking for, attending different meetings within those communities to ask certain questions, having conversations with individuals who represent those communities, and actually genuine questions and authentic questions as it pertains to what really is needed. Because if you don't have an understanding, but you decide that you have an organization and you're just gonna pop up, what are you really servicing? What market research did you really do? You're just doing it because of it, the idea of having an organization. And I definitely didn't want no parts of that. I'm a former college professor and administrator of 10 years, walked away from it in 2018 after spending 10 years of watching African-American males walk onto college campuses every single year and not having the necessary resources to even be there. But somebody went into their communities and told them, oh, we would have all these things in place for you to be successful. And which I knew after like 6 years, I knew that was completely false and wrong. You can't give stuff like that out, that kind of information out, if you don't really have it to give. So the academy I wanted it to be exactly what was wrong, what I noticed was wrong. And our boys, we wanted to make sure that they had a space where they had a greater understanding for themselves of who they are and who they wanted to be, so that when it was time to navigate those spaces, they knew how to navigate it. And when we had 5 boys graduating this June from high school, one of them is headed to Montclair State University, another one's headed to Temple University, and then we have 3 headed to County College, right? And as I stand in those situations with them, visiting those colleges, going to getting the paperwork ready, I see the confidence they have. And I don't think they would have had that confidence before that, right? So being able to have real conversations with our communities before we just pop up and say, oh, we're here to help. What are you here to help to do?
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. I think, and one of the things that I think we have to do, I'm going to take the term social emotion SEL programming, is to probably not use that language, to be perfectly honest. Because already, if you say, how do we bring SEL programming into communities, we're already thinking we're bringing in a package that we're going to deliver. And that's not how you should, as RB said, that's not how you should approach communities. So if we just unbundle it, if we start with the facts, first, learning and development are social and emotional. If you don't feel socially safe, and you don't feel, if you don't feel socially engaged and emotionally safe, you're not going to learn. You're going to shut down. And if this is a voluntary program that you're coming to, and it's not offering those basics of supportive developmental relationships and making sure that you have a sense of safety and belonging, telling me that you're going to be doing skill building doesn't matter, because I'm just not going to come, or I'm not going to stay. That SEL skill building has to be embedded in some kind of relevant, interest-driven content, whether it's social justice content, it's recreation, it's employment training, it's arts and music, it's cultural. It has to be embedded. So we really do want to honor the fact that we know a lot about how critically important it is to acknowledge the need for helping young people name, practice, and build their social emotional skills and competencies. But I think when we walk in with the mindset of we're bringing in SEL programming, we walk in with a mindset that puts up a barrier to communities.
I completely agree, and one of the things that comes to mind as you were talking, Karen, is sort of the value of the after workforce as having a set of cultural assets. And like first is checking that they actually do have a set of cultural assets. In many cases, they are more likely to be from local communities and closer connected geographically and in terms of background to some of the students, and to recognize that. And not to say, oh, well, we've got all the answers because look at these demographics, but to use that as a place of curiosity for teachers and after school educators to build relationships that are actually grounded in their own cultural backgrounds and assets. And that then starts to translate into naturally sort of having those appear in the school day and in the after school. But that comes from what Karen was saying earlier, sort of building relationships. And it starts with the principal site director. And then it moves to sort of a core team of sort of school and after school folks who are kind of the early adopters. And then it diffuses out to really seeing yourselves as a joint faculty, a set of adults who are working in a common purpose that's grounded in sort of a very human understanding of your own cultural assets and backgrounds that you're bringing to that group.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you all are saying. And I think I would just add, when we think about listening and community engagement, for us to think about how we can also engage young people as kind of partners in creating the kinds of, opportunities or environments or initiatives that, that we all want. I think we've all seen that when young people lead, really amazing things happen. And so I think that holds true for this space as well. So yeah, just encouraging us to think about how youth can be partners and leaders in this kind of imagining of environments and SEL programming, so to speak, as well.
Hey, Lucy, you hit it right on the nail. Actually asking the students what they want. Like, what are they, asking them poignant questions as to what it is that they would like themselves. I think a lot of times that's not done. We just expect these professionals with these degrees to be able to answer all the questions, but the kids who are the ones there to receive the information, or we want to receive the information, they're the ones who know what they really want. So having them involved in the conversation is key.
Fantastic. Yes, I agree with you 100% about involving the student, especially when having those conversations of what they need and how to move forward. Thank you all for answering these questions. And now I'm going to dive into the individual questions. First is RB Alverno.
Yes.
So we have, looking at the Academy 365, what made you decide to select your current 5 initiatives? What was the planning around specifically Black Boys Heal and Women's Worth 101?
Oh man, Black Boys Heal. So the Black Boys plus mental health. I read an article when I started to do my dissertation research, and it was in reference to how we had more Black boys were dying more at a higher rate in terms of suicide rather than their white counterparts. And I said, what is going on? But then I knew the answer to it immediately, but couldn't figure it out until like delving on it a little bit more. It's because they don't have access to certain resources that's their counterparts may have. So when we created the academy, mental health plus Black boys was one of our flagship initiatives that we wanted to make sure we placed in the community. So our parents, our community leaders understood what was going on and what they needed to start looking out for, because we can't allow this to continue to take place. And mental health needs to be something that needs to really be held in conversation as it pertains to our students, especially our Black boys, because they go through things on a daily basis. Their heightened vigilance scale is at an all-time high, right? It's at an all-time high because they have to find ways to navigate through certain trauma, daily trauma that they have to experience. They may not integrate well into schools. Why is that, right? So really having those conversations and having that understanding. So when we created the Black Boys plus mental health, we wanted that to be something that's taking place every single year in our community, so that our communities understand this is the conversation. These are the important conversations that need to be taking place. For the Women's Worth 101 project, like I said in the beginning, my mom raised me very well. So I wanted our boys to have an understanding of the importance of having healthy communications with females, and that whatever they may have learned or saw somewhere else may not be the right thing. So how do you have appropriate communication? And these conversations aren't being held in schools. So we were having real life conversations with them, and what those conversations really need to be as it pertains to having healthy relationships, how to respect women, period, across the board. Because I don't remember ever being taught besides my parents how to really treat women, and how to really have communication with women, and what are the certain things you need to make sure you are mindful of when communicating with women, how to develop relationships, and what are those different types of relationships, right? We have intimate relationships, you have professional relationships. What are those different relationships, and how do you respect boundaries? So we wanted to really make sure we took a strong emphasis on that. And so that initiative is actually ran by a psychologist who, a good friend of mine's, who I wanted to make sure that she was the one who did it, because I had seen her do a presentation for girls, and I said, well, how do we take this same information and flip it around and get it, and so that boys have this information, so then they know how to navigate certain spaces, stuff like that. So that was the mindset behind it. It's really taking an authentic approach and a proactive approach instead of being reactive, especially in the Me Too movement, and wanted to make sure certain things didn't take place. So that's why we went that route.
RB, thank you so much. So next is Karen Pitman. Karen, the Readiness Project's mission is to change the odds for youth by using science-informed strategies to upend inequity and accelerate progress across the settings and systems where learning happens. How does a focus on social and emotional learning and science-informed strategies help those you work with accelerate progress to change the odds for youth?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I'll try to answer it quickly. And I've spoken to a little bit of this. The Readiness Projects, which is a joint project done by the Forum for Youth Investment, the National Urban League, the American Institutes for Research, and now about sort of 30 other co-strategists along with us from schools and community organizations, mostly national organizations. It really grew out of both the opportunity and to some extent the frustration that we had with on the SEED Commission. And David Adams was one of the folks on the SEED Commission with us. That's the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. Great progress was made in really sort of having the conversation that we just had about how schools have to shift from thinking these are skills that have to be added to an outcomes list that we have to teach kids, to looking at the learning environment to see if you really created a learning environment in which young people really feel safe and supportive enough to engage so that they can practice and strengthen their skills. So there was a mindset shift that happened with the SEED Commission that's evident in the reports that are coming out. But for us, it didn't push far enough on two fronts. One, it really didn't acknowledge all of the settings and all of the adults that are really being intentional about supporting learning and development. And the second was it didn't have just a sharp enough focus on equity and how we really can assess those settings and train and support those adults to really make sure we got the right mix from a cultural and a racial and an ethnic perspective to make sure that the meaning making that is happening in those settings really happens. So when you ask how does social and emotional learning sort of undergird what we're doing, it really did sort of start the train moving. And this has been a train that's been, you know, if you've been on this youth development train as long as I have, this is a train that has picked up more speed because of SEL, because we have finally gotten schools talking about we don't just have to teach content and we don't just have to teach skills. We need to look carefully at the environments that we create and make sure that we really are engaging young people. In working with the SOLD Alliance, which is the science of learning and development, which sort of started around in parallel with the SEED Commission, but really focused on the brain science of how learning happens and what do we know. That really gave us an opportunity to step back just from the SEL space, from the skill building, naming and building skill space, to say what makes an optimal learning environment. And so we carried that idea forward. And it really is these 5 non-negotiable things. It starts with healthy developmental relationships. And we can put more in the chat about this. You then really have to make sure that young people are feeling safe and feeling a strong sense of belonging, not just individual belonging, but collective belonging. Then you got to make sure there are rich instructional experiences and knowledge development. Doesn't have to be academic at all, but interest driven is also important. Then we have to make sure that you really are being intentional about naming, providing opportunities to practice, and then clearly providing skill development in those important skills and competencies areas. And then the last piece of this sort of blue wheel, as we call it, is to talk about making sure that you've got integrated supports if needed. If young people need extra support in anything, do we really have the capacity and the staff to really connect young people to those supports? Those really turn out to be the non-negotiables for creating optimal learning environments. And the thing that has been important in helping us have these conversations to connect across settings and systems is saying every environment doesn't have to sing in all of those areas, but none of them can be in the red. As soon as you focus so much on one of those things that you're not paying attention to the others, you really are potentially doing harm. And that's the place where if young people can leave voluntarily, they will. And if they can't leave because they're required to be there, you could actively be doing harm. So a part of what SEL has allowed us to do is to start the conversation about the importance of understanding learning is social and emotional. Young people will try to leave places that are socially and emotionally harmful for them. We have to start there before we talk about how we're going to optimize. And that's really where this conversation has been able to happen. The last thing that I'll say really quickly is this has also given us an opportunity to bring a piece of the Forum for Youth Investment, which has really been a deliberate piece for the past 15 years, which is the Weichert Center on Youth Program Quality. So over here in the youth development space, we've always assumed that quality programs had a lot of those elements. But we've been able to intentionally come back and go, how do you really make sure that a program that leads with relationships and leads with belonging and leads with interest-driven activities is paying enough attention to being intentional about social emotional skill development, which starts with getting kids to name them, getting kids to talk about them, getting kids to practice them, and then certainly making sure you have staff who really are understanding specific practices that they can do. So it's given us a chance to really bring that idea of we can intentionally assess and improve the quality of learning settings and make them better places for this kind of skill building to happen into a broader space. So that's how we're hoping that with all that happening, we accelerate progress and do that exactly through organizations like Lucy's and Saskia's and RB's.
Thank you so much, Karen. Our next question, we have 2 more questions, and then I'm going to look at the Q&A so we can have like 2 or 3 minutes to answer the participants' questions. But we're going to dive into asking Lucy Hertz. As a co-founder of Student Success Network since 2013, how have you been seeing social emotional learning tie into your culture, the culture and policies at your organization?
Sure. So this is a big question, and I will say that I'm certainly not an expert on this, but I'll just offer some kind of thoughts that we've been having. So as we've kind of all been talking about, I think, we really see SEL as a process and something that grounds everything we do, where we're creating strong relationships, co-learning, examining root causes of inequity together, collaboratively developing solutions, all the things we've been talking about. And so, we really think that these are processes that are critical not only for young people, but for the ways in which adults operate too. And so I think the short answer is, when we kind of shift our view from SEL as only a set of outcomes to an approach, or, a way of doing things, it kind of helps consider everything you're doing as an organization through that lens. And so we try to, embody this in the ways in which we collaborate as a team, how we work together and partner with our network members, how we partner with young people. And so a couple concrete examples that we've been kind of working towards. One is that we've been really thinking more and more about how to have actual paid positions for young people on our team to lead different initiatives, to really try to lean into this, youth voice effort. And so now we have 2 young people on our team who kind of help lead our youth program and also facilitate and co-create some of our broader network initiatives. Another example is really kind of rethinking the way in which research happens, which we know is oftentimes top-down and not very SEL-y. And right now we're kind of developing a research project that is going to engage primarily youth, but also practitioners as researchers in developing research questions, themselves based on their own lived experiences, and then carrying out the research itself. So all that said, it's a journey. We're definitely not there yet, but again, kind of situating SEL as a lifelong process and lens definitely helps.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And our final question goes to Saskia. Saskia, when planning, how do you center social emotional learning in program and policy development?
Thanks. It's a tough question. I would answer it in maybe a couple different layers. So one is thinking about the system. And so we work with about 900 after-school programs throughout New York City. And there are policies and systems that are probably many of the root causes that Lucy sort of unveils in some of the discussions. And so policy just gets in the way a lot of times of the things that we know that we need to do for young people. So I think one answer is to just encourage teams at the school level to ignore the policy for a minute. And then let's come back to it and figure out how you comply with your contractual grant agreements. But let's ignore it for a moment. And then let's figure out, then we'll solve those problems after we know what we actually want to accomplish. At the system level, that's sort of true too. And they are in fact policymakers who feel that same sense of pressure from above or outside for their own policies. And so one of the projects that we've been working on with Urban Assembly and with Dave and Brandon and others is actually looking at our city systems for social and emotional learning and work that we want to do with young people, and having those folks who are the effective policymakers meet and talk about what they care about for young people, without actually talking about any specific policies or advocacy efforts, but actually about the practice that happens in schools and after school programs. And so those folks are building trust and building common understanding. And, none of the policies are changing yet, right? It's really that these same folks who are writing the RFPs, who are setting grant conditions and guidelines, are getting to know each other and building trust with one another. This grew out of the Nation at Hope report from the Seed Commission that Karen referenced. And I think in addition to the two things that you referenced, Karen, sort of, that there was not as much of a centering of equity, and that there was, that we didn't talk about all settings and all adults. I think there was also a little bit of like, how do we use this in a city like New York? How do we actually take this mindset shift and turn it into practice? And so our group is called the City at Hope group, and it's a working group of practitioners and policymakers who are kind of building that trust and that sense of relationships and this mindset shift in New York. And one of our conversations was about how much we as a city value our diversity and the fact that people come from all over the world to New York City, and that in fact New York City as a city believes strongly in social emotional skills that are used on the sidewalk every day, that are used in navigating a pandemic, that are used in getting on the subway, and that we need to lift up those city messages to recognize that we're not even really talking about just schools, we're talking about communities and in fact cities. And that then all translates into policy. So that's one sort of avenue. And then I'll just quickly say the other avenue is the more technical side, is that in every MOU, in every sort of document that schools and community partners put together, we ask them to reflect on and think about their shared social emotional, their goals for social emotional supports for adults and kids. And so you just get this documented in the places where the money is flowing, again, to remind them of what they already, what they've said to us and what they already believe. And so there's the sort of technical side of this too.
I agree, Saskia. Thank you so much for everyone for responding to these amazing, interesting questions. We do have 2 questions from our participants, specifically our Urban Assembly, amazing Vincent Hertz. And if we don't get to the second question, I apologize. Actually, our CEO, David Adams. If any of the panelists want to answer directly in the Q&A tab, please do so. But I'm going to let you guys know, Vinny Hertz has asked, because after school programs are largely about special interest clubs, cultural activities, special events, and academic work, would you agree with me that CBOs apply a great deal of indirect SEL to kids from those experiences?
I think the short answer is yes. Again, I'll sort of reference the Learning Hero study that just came out, but we'll not try to drop it in the chat. When you ask parents specifically what they're looking for, that's exactly what they're looking for. They think they send their kids to school for reading and math and problem solving and focused work. And then they are explicitly looking, and they use the term extracurricular when they asked, what do you call this stuff? They are then looking for these kind of programs. And they look very seriously for them when they can afford to and afford to have choices. That's exactly what they're looking for. And the assumption is not so much that they're sending their young people there to these programs to be taught these skills, but that they're sending them there to use their skills, to practice their skills, to get their skills reinforced and then strengthened. And so there's just a different language that parents are using when they're thinking about community programs.
Thank you so much, Karen. And then our final question from our CEO, David Adams. We have 1 minute. Youth development professionals have been investing in SEL with folks from the community long before schools caught on. How can we honor their contributions to SEL now that many schools have adopted the framework?
I won't answer both questions.
My quick answer would be to start the conversation about what the framework means to a school, because then once they recognize this is what we want, then an after-school organization can say, We may not use the same terms, but we think we can help with that. But you need them to say, it needs to come, I think, from school first, and then to say we're ready, and let us walk you through what we've done.
Thank you so much, Saskia. Thank you to our panelists, everyone who has joined us today in this extremely important conversation discussion.